In the last episode, I left you in suspense as to the outcome of my final game in the first 3 rounds of the league, the game against Sotokahu. At this point, I am 5 for 5 games in the league, and I've clawed this one back from a dire mid-game position to a potentially winnable end game. The first break in the weather is May 1945, so under the current rules this would also be the last turn of the game, but under the rules this game was played under, which is the published 2nd edition rules, there will be 2 more turns, and one of those, July, is guaranteed to be fair weather. As you can see, the Western forces have made it to the Rhine, Italy has fallen, and the Soviets have crossed the Oder. The Germans have 38 national will, and have succeeded in rebuilding most of their units, but have not been able to recover the Luftwaffe, partly because the Allied forces are pressing too close and there are too few safe spaces to do so. The Allies are at full strength, critically including their considerable air power, and normally at this stage you expect the Axis to lose something like 10 to 20 national will in each fair weather turn. So 1 turn is going to be an Axis win, 3 should be an Allied win, but 2 is on the knife edge. Let's find out what happened in this case. The first stage of this is the German counterpunch. This faces real difficulties. The Germans have only 20 production points, and it would, for example, take 11 production points just to activate the units currently on the French front, and at the moment 17 production points on the Eastern Front, so there just isn't enough to do both. The conventional wisdom is that counterpunches in the endgame should be directed against the Soviets, and that killing 6 units is enough to take the sting out of the Soviet attack. But that with the massive air superiority, the Western forces aren't really touchable. Let's see how Sotokahu handles it. And like I'm suggesting, I think the attacks here on the Western Front are a mistake. They're also conducted as assaults, starting with this one near Amsterdam. I've discussed this in other episodes, but despite the tempting dice roll modifiers that can be created with an assault, you need to make multiple poor odds mobile attacks, if nothing else because it draws Allied air units into the fighting and reduces the amount of Allied air available for their counterattack. Air power is incredibly useful, but spending it is much more decisive on the offensive than the defensive. On the Eastern Front, Sotokahu falls into a supply trap. That is not going to help. That unit on the southeast corner of the Alps would need to route its supply northwest, and the hex at 3127 needs to be covered by a unit, which it is not. So, the Axis counterpunch doesn't succeed, and now I need to work out what to do with the Western forces. I think my best odds are around Aachen. The Panzer to the southwest is actually in Belgium, so I can use a partisan marker on that. And I prep the whole attack before I make my first actual move. A surprise marker goes in at Dusseldorf, an airdrop at Aachen itself to ease the attack across the river into a city, and a partisan marker on the 4th Panzer. This way, if I take Aachen on the first attack, I can make 2 attacks on the isolated Panzer. That won't open a hole, but it goes a long way to doing so. And it kills a German unit, which is instantly 1 national will. And these are good odds for my initial attack, which pay off. I take out the Panzer with the first unit, and I manage to get a DD on the retreating Aachen unit with the second. So now my attention turns north to the open ground above Dusseldorf, which I hope to surround. And this retreat is worth discussing. One of the first tactics videos I did was on retreats and how small, subtle differences are made with each one, and you make a lot of retreats over the course of the game, so cumulatively they can have a big effect. In this case, the German unit, which suffered a DD, had 2 choices, northeast or east. I suspect, fearing a second DD and the creation of a no enemy zone of control that could be exploited, Sotokahu retreated northeast. But I don't think it was the right call. It means the unit is isolated on my next attack, which practically guarantees it being destroyed. And I think it could have been retreated to the east, because the exploit is nowhere near as scary as it initially looks. The Panzer cannot actually be pinned. the hex to the southwest is open because the 1st Canadian is the only Allied unit operating up here, and even a DD on the German infantry is not terrible. Bremen and Dusseldorf are both defended, and the unit does not have enough movement points to attack either. Even if it did, it would be out of supply and opening a horrible gap in the western rear lines. So I think the sacrifice moving the unit northeast here wasn't technically necessary. That was potentially 1 point of national will that could have been saved. Let's turn to the Italian front. Ideally, I would not have 3 full units and a garrison down here, but let's make the best of a bad job. The attack by the Second Army was conducted to open a path for the garrison. That can pin the German Afrika Korps for the Russians. I also destroyed the garrison in Venice, but don't enter the city. I will be shifting the American units to the French front and leaving the Soviets to operate through the supply line that Venice controls. Remember, technically the Soviet and Western forces count as hostile powers, so they interfere with each other's supply lines. By the end of the Western turn, I've knocked out 5 German units and reduced them to 32 national will. Over to the Soviets. Okay, so how to build a plan of attack here. The German position is important. The elite parachute unit and 3 of the 4 armour are located in the northern section of the line. So the weakest section is in the south. My first effort is to try and isolate the Axis infantry, which is blocking me in the centre. There is an important effect here. Normally, once you are in Germany, the German units get supply from their cities, even if they are surrounded, which means it's hard work digging them out of their positions. But if I can push towards Munich, I can slice the supply for the entire pocket of units in the Alps. I'm able to break through and close the trap on the units in the Alps, and this is good. It opens a line of attack against Munich, and the 3rd Guards tank will be able to get 2 attacks in on the city. I've got enough air power to support both of them. Breakthroughs at Munich are always devastating, and this game is no exception. The breakthrough seizes Stuttgart and links up with the Western forces and throws out a screen that cuts a lot of retreat spaces in the north. Note that I will need to use a strategic move to bring another unit through in order to actually create a proper line above Munich, but no question, this has been a big success for the Soviets. I make no ground in the north, even against pinned panzers in the open. It's a little unlucky given that I had potentially 13 attacks. I might have hoped for at least 1-6-1. But it's still a successful turn. The forces around Berlin are the last significant strength the Axis have. They are down to 24 national will, so I took 14 this turn. And I've killed or pocketed a lot of units, leaving Hanover and Leipzig vulnerable. June is poor weather, so this will at least be interesting. Just to be clear, because it's a point that comes up a lot in discussions of the game, I like the random weather. It makes sense thematically. What I don't like about it is the effect it has, which is clearly wrong in a simulation sense. The difference between fair and poor weather in the game is just much larger than it historically was. Units make too much ground in fair weather, they don't make enough ground in poor or severe. And I do not understand why the design team is so committed to not fixing this. The design team consistently chooses any time this is addressed in the game to reduce how random the weather is, to make it more deterministic, and to refuse to address the effect it has on combats. But it's the effect on combats, not the random nature, that's the problem. To be clear, how the weather falls absolutely should shift the odds in the final offensive, because historically it did, and would have affected Allied offensives. But in the rules as they stand, those 2 dice rolls are everything. 3 turns of fair weather would pretty much always have been an Allied victory. 1 turn would always have been an Axis victory. And I don't think it would be hard to alter the effect, so 1 turn would only probably have been an Axis victory, and 3 turns only probably an Allied victory, and that in the 5 in 6 games that the weather didn't fall exactly as it did here, that it would have depended in part on player skill. Anyway, we did get the one rather unusual combination of turns that would make this interesting, and it's worth talking about this. Why is that German panzer trying to break out of that position? What is the purpose? And this is a really key bit of endgame tactics that I find is commonly misplayed. I think, in general, Sota Kahu played a much stronger mid-game than an endgame. My experience is that most players play quite weak endgames relative to my own, which often makes it, this is not the only game this has happened in, worth my while to play out what should probably be lost mid-game positions, especially with the allies. If you're interested in sharpening your endgame play, I strongly suggest playing the 43 and 44 scenarios. They're not well balanced in their victory conditions, but they are good scenarios. And one of the things that you learn, one of the key disciplines you get there, is not to spend production points with the Axis without a purpose. If a unit is surrounded, like the 5th Panzer is here, and you cannot do something useful with it, then just leave it surrounded. There is no point in the big cat thrashing around and just weakening its own position and draining your production points. If I were to do anything with it here, it would have been to attack towards Venice, where the Soviet units are in a supply trap and it can link up with the Afrika Korps and potentially create a small pocket that's relatively hard to reduce. They'd still be dead, but they might last longer and not cost the Axis quite as much national will. With the Western forces, I don't expect to make a lot of ground. Not in poor weather, but I'm hoping to take out the pocketed unit at Stuttgart and cross the river into Frankfurt. One attack or two to try and clear Frankfurt. The odds are 10 in 36 or 19 in 36, so the answer is 2 attacks if you're trying to do that, if all you're interested in is taking the city. But complication, you don't really want to be spending air power this turn. And if you don't spend the air power, that switches the odds to 6 in 36 or 14 in 36. And since 6 in 36 is a 1 in 6 chance of success on 2 dice, is one of those calculations you should be able to roll straight off the top of your head. It's 11 in 36. A single attack is better if you're not spending the air. The fragility of the German position at this point is shown by the Western forces taking 6 national will, despite the poor weather. The vulnerability in the north I can just put up with. After all, the Germans cannot regain national will by taking towns in Amsterdam. The Germans are now on 18 national will at the end of the Allied turn. I get 2 of the German units pinned down in the Alps with the Soviets, but not the 3rd, which is at the awkward junction between Western and Soviet forces. As I suspected, the Panzer's attempt to break out did not do it any favours. Not much ground gained, and at the end of the turn the Germans have 16 national will, so 1 guaranteed turn of fair weather, and the question is, am I going to take 16 national will in that turn? It's definitely possible, though there is a lot of German armour strength to overcome. Looking at the map, there are 4 German cities which are unoccupied. In principle, they could all get a unit built in them, but I will say this, the Germans should only build garrisons, which do not lose national will if eliminated. I can also see 2 isolated German units which are bound to fall, and Dusseldorf won't hold, so I've got at least 4. The question is, where am I going to get the other 12 from? July. The Panzer could have pinned the 1st Canadian before attacking. Would that have been worth it? I'd have been tempted to fall back behind the Ems River. Note the 6th Panzer is taking a big risk. If it does not succeed in dislodging the 1st Canadian, it can be isolated by a landing northwest of Bremen. It does dislodge the 1st Canadian on the 2nd attack, so it turns out that that doesn't matter very much. This attack didn't quite make sense to me. I'm not quite sure what is gained by attacking across the Rhine. Surely no German unit actually wants to advance across the Rhine, and it's not recapturing a town to recover national will. So I didn't spend any air power defending against the assault. However, I do want to prevent a breakout here. I don't want this unit getting back into supply because that's going to make it really tough to then take it out on my turn and spend resources I do not want to spend. Okay, so now it's my turn with the Western forces. I break through Dusseldorf easily. That leaves the Panzer isolated. It's even isolated. It's an SS Panzer unit. It's seriously tough, so I give it an airdrop marker on top of the isolation. And this, by the way, the fact that I did isolate it here is one of the reasons that I felt it would have been better off on the other side of the Ems River in a defensive position. So I do eliminate it, and then I turn to pushing forward with the Western forces. Bremen falls fairly easily. Hanover puts up more of a fight, requiring several attacks, but I eventually take it. Note that I don't actually care about supply on the last turn of the game, so I didn't bother running any of the convoys just to save myself time, which is why all of the Allied units here appear out of supply. At this point, the Germans are now down to 4 national wills, so I think that this is basically over. In general, this proved an instructive and interesting endgame. In general, I would have assumed I would need some real luck with the weather in order to recover the mid-game position I was in. But while my luck with the weather's been reasonable, I had an early month on the Eastern Front, in October-November in 44, and I got 2 months in the final endgame. It's not exceptional. From a lot of the discussions I've seen, the position in the mid-game that we had here is one that most Allied players would have quit in 1942. Yes, some of this is down to Sotokahu making small errors that allowed me in the end game to make more ground, but I didn't play a perfect game either. But I think it shows the importance of not writing a game off as lost. I think if you had 2 players who really were very good and whose level of play was equivalent through mid and end game, then probably the mid game position was lost. But in reality, in the league, even at the top end, I don't think that's really the case. I do not think there's a pool of players who are sufficiently strong that games can be called in 42 or 43. So with the end of this game, I had completed all my 6 games from the opening 3 rounds. And I thought it would be interesting now to look at some stats and standings from the first 3 rounds of the league. These games were all played under the 2nd edition rules, not what I'm calling 2.5, which is how the 4th round onwards have been played. Looking at the log of games, I've tried to divide the games up by their opening and record the result. Unsurprisingly, the historical opening is the most common by quite a large margin. And I would caution against reading too much into that 4-0 East-First split. My suspicion is that experienced players are more likely to choose non-standard openings, and it's the Axis player who chooses, so the discrepancy may have more to do with the relative player skill in those East-First games, where it's easy to misplay them as the Allies. Having said that, I think the 2-0 long result is real. Played correctly, I think the long opening under the 2nd edition rules is by far the strongest available to the Axis, and so cannot fault to remove it, or at least to prevent the Wasp Sting variant in the revised rules. There's now a complete set of games for those first 3 rounds. For all the players, 18 in total, though not everybody participated in every round. Note that the league was divided at this point into 2 divisions, allowing newer players to play more competitive games in the lower division. I can imagine how frustrating it would be for a player on their first or second full game to run up against an opponent who's familiar with something like the long opening or the full range of gambits. So it's good that there's another group where you can play your first few competitive games before you decide if you want to be in this. But for the purposes of standings, I'm only including players who participated in the upper league. As I've explained in previous videos, there is no effective tiebreaker in the game. National will works when the Axis win, but not when the Allies win. The logical alternative is to use some multiple of how many turns early the Allies are, but there isn't a general agreement on that. So we're just going to go by win percentage for overall standings. Because people have not played an equal number of games, I'm giving every player a dummy loss, meaning a perfect winning streak counts more if you've played more games, and the best score anyone can have in the first 3 rounds will be 86%. And importantly, Ramsay Bolton, who only played 1 round, finishes a little bit behind Camber even though Campbell lost a game. Here I calculate all of those percentage values, and here I reorganise the games by that win percentage, and we can see that WKSP's position took a bit of a hit with 2 losses in the third round, dropping them from the top slot last time I discussed this to 6th. Cornet of Horse has, however, kept a perfect winning streak, so congratulations for that. Anyway, for now, here endeth the lesson, and with the next episode, we'll be looking at my games in the 4th round of the league.